Hi, welcome to Creepy Crime Cases. On today's episode, we will be covering a case that has a mix of murder, madness, and cannibalism. I want to personally welcome you to today's episode. Thank you for your time. I will be seeing you at the end. In the winter of 2012, a case emerged from the city of Bridgeport, Connecticut, that would disturb even the most hardened investigators. It was a crime so brutal, so incomprehensible, that it left an imprint on the collective memory of the community. At the center of it all was a man named Tyree Lincoln Smith. Born in 1976, Smith grew up in Connecticut, moving between relatives and family homes, never finding a place of true stability. Friends and acquaintances from his younger years would later describe him as quiet, at times withdrawn, and often struggling to fit into the world around him. Behind closed doors, however, Smith battled something far darker than shyness or solitude. He was haunted by mental illness, a condition that would worsen with age and, in time, unleash horrors no one could have predicted. By his mid-30s, Smith's life had drifted into chaos. He had no permanent home, no steady work, and little contact with those who once knew him. Instead, his days were marked by long stretches of isolation and episodes of erratic behavior. He spoke at times of voices only he could hear, voices that instructed him, guided him, and demanded from him things beyond human reason. His condition, left untreated and unmanaged, became the breeding ground for tragedy. In the months leading up to the crime, Smith's presence was noticed on the margins of Bridgeport. He drifted between temporary places of shelter, sometimes staying with family, sometimes sleeping wherever he could. On the surface, he appeared as another struggling man caught in the grip of poverty and instability. But beneath that surface, something terrifying was forming, a convergence of untreated schizophrenia, delusion, and violence. The voices he claimed to hear grew louder. To Smith, they were not abstract sounds or fleeting illusions. They were commanding forces, whispering and urging him toward a specific destiny. He later described these voices as powerful and insistent, directing him to commit an act that would make headlines around the world. Bridgeport, like many aging industrial cities, had its share of abandoned properties, crumbling buildings that stood as relics of a past era. One of these buildings, an apartment house on Brook Street, would soon become the setting for an unthinkable act. For Tyree Smith, this derelict space provided not just shelter but a stage where his darkest impulses could take shape. In January of 2012, Smith encountered Angel "Tun-tun" Gonzalez, a 43-year-old man known in the community for his hardships but also his warmth. Gonzalez had no way of knowing the danger that would unfold when he crossed paths with Smith. To those who knew him, Angel was a vulnerable man, living on the edge of society, trying to survive day by day. For Smith, however, Gonzalez became something else entirely, the object of his voices, the vessel through which his delusions would manifest. On that cold January night, inside the walls of the abandoned apartment, Tyree Smith carried out a killing that would shock the nation. Armed with a hatchet, he unleashed a level of violence that spoke not just of anger or desperation, but of a mind completely severed from reality. The act that followed was even more disturbing. Smith mutilated his victim, consuming parts of Gonzalez's body in a ritual that defied comprehension. It was not just murder, it was cannibalism. The crime scene, when later discovered by authorities, bore the unmistakable mark of a mind undone by madness. What Smith had done inside that apartment was not merely an act of violence. It was the outward expression of years of untreated mental illness, finally bursting into reality with devastating consequences. In the hours and days that followed, Smith would wander through the city, detached from the enormity of what he had done. He told some relatives of the voices that had driven him, of the blood on his hands, and of the pieces of his victim that he had eaten. These confessions would eventually bring the police to his door, beginning an investigation that would unravel one of the most unsettling murder cases in Connecticut's history. As investigators moved in, the details of what happened on Brook Street would come into sharper focus. But for the community of Bridgeport, the damage was already done. A fragile sense of safety had been shattered, and the name Tyree Lincoln Smith would forever be linked with one of the darkest chapters in the city's history. When word of the killing first reached Bridgeport police, the details were so grotesque that seasoned detectives struggled to believe what they were hearing. Reports came from family members, who had been alarmed by the disturbing statements Tyree Lincoln Smith made in the days after the murder. He had spoken of blood, of voices, and of acts too horrific to repeat. His own cousin told authorities that Smith confessed to eating part of a man's brain. Acting quickly, investigators moved to confirm whether these accounts were delusions or reality. They were directed to an abandoned apartment house on Brook Street, a crumbling three-story structure that stood as a reminder of better days long gone. The building was in disrepair, windows shattered, doors unhinged, graffiti marking the walls. Yet within those walls, police would uncover a scene of almost unimaginable horror. As they entered the abandoned apartment, the stench of decay filled the air. The rooms were cold, littered with trash and broken furniture. In one of the units, officers found the remains of Angel Gonzalez. He lay motionless on the floor, his body brutally attacked, the evidence of violence visible in every detail. Gonzalez's wounds told the story of his final moments, repeated blows from a hatchet, inflicted with force and frenzy. His body had been mutilated, portions of it missing in a way that could not be explained by simple rage. For investigators, the crime scene was both shocking and deeply unsettling. The brutality of the attack was beyond what they typically encountered, but the mutilation suggested something darker, an act that crossed the line into ritualistic violence. Blood patterns on the walls and floor painted a picture of the struggle that had taken place. Shards of glass crunched underfoot as officers documented every inch of the scene, aware that they were standing in the aftermath of one of the most disturbing crimes in the city's history. The medical examiner was called to the scene, and the grim process of recovery began. Gonzalez's remains were removed carefully, each wound catalogued with precision. The findings confirmed what Smith himself had claimed. This was not only a killing but an act of cannibalism. Tissue had been removed, consumed by the very man who had carried out the attack. Back at police headquarters, detectives pieced together the timeline. Witness statements painted a consistent picture. Smith had been staying with relatives around the time of the murder, moving restlessly between homes. It was during one of these visits that he reportedly confessed. His cousin recalled how Smith arrived with traces of blood on him, speaking in chilling detail about killing a man with a hatchet, eating his brain and one of his eyes, and then leaving the body in the apartment. The relative's account was so specific, so vivid, that investigators knew they had to act immediately. An arrest warrant was soon issued. By this time, Smith had already left Connecticut and was traced to Florida, where he was eventually taken into custody without incident. His demeanor during arrest was calm, almost detached, as though the enormity of his actions had not yet reached him. Back in Connecticut, forensic teams continued their work. Evidence collected from the crime scene was compared with Smith's belongings, further tying him to the murder. The hatchet, identified as the weapon used, was recovered and tested. Blood evidence confirmed the victim's identity and linked Smith directly to the attack. News of the murder spread quickly through Bridgeport. Local residents, already familiar with the challenges of crime and poverty, were shaken by the sheer brutality of what had happened in their city. As the investigation deepened, one question loomed larger than any other. Why had Tyree Lincoln Smith committed such an atrocity? The answer, investigators realized, could not be found in traditional motives like money, revenge, or passion. Instead, the answer lay in Smith's mind, a mind tormented by schizophrenia, where reality and delusion had become hopelessly entangled. The path forward was clear. Smith would face charges of murder, and the courts would have to determine not only his guilt but also the role his mental illness played in his actions. For the family of Angel Gonzalez, this was a painful reality to accept. Their loved one had been taken in the most horrific manner, and now the man responsible was described not as a criminal mastermind, but as someone broken by his own mind. The stage was set for a trial that would test the boundaries between justice, mercy, punishment, and treatment. Before the courts could decide his fate, however, the public would first learn the full details of what had happened inside that abandoned apartment. And the story they heard would haunt them for years to come. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with unease. Relatives of Angel Gonzalez sat in the gallery, their grief etched on their faces as prosecutors began to outline what had happened to their loved one. The brutality of the crime was difficult enough to accept, but the added reality of cannibalism pushed the tragedy into an entirely different realm of horror. For the Gonzalez family, every word spoken in court was another reminder of a loss that defied understanding. Prosecutors presented the case with precision. The evidence was clear, the testimony compelling. By all appearances, the state's case was airtight. Yet beneath the surface, there was another layer to this trial, one that would shift the focus from guilt to sanity. Smith's attorneys did not dispute that he had killed Angel Gonzalez. Instead, they argued that his actions were the direct result of untreated mental illness, specifically schizophrenia. They painted a picture of a man tormented by voices, compelled by delusions, and incapable of distinguishing reality from hallucination. This was not the work of a rational mind, they said, but of a man lost in psychosis. The courtroom listened as experts took the stand. Psychiatrists explained how schizophrenia can distort perception, creating powerful hallucinations and delusions that feel as real as the world itself. In Smith's case, they testified, the voices had commanded him to kill, convincing him that the act was not only necessary but unavoidable. To these experts, Smith was not motivated by cruelty or revenge. He was driven by a mind broken by illness. The prosecution acknowledged Smith's mental illness but argued that the severity of his actions demanded accountability. A man was dead, his life taken in a brutal manner, and his family left with immeasurable grief. To simply dismiss the crime as the product of insanity, they warned, risked undermining justice itself. The judge and jury faced a daunting task. They were asked not only to weigh the facts of the crime but also to peer into the complexities of mental illness. Could a man be held criminally responsible when his grip on reality was so fractured? Was Tyree Lincoln Smith a murderer in the traditional sense, or was he something different? A man consumed by madness, dangerous not because of choice but because of illness? For the family of Angel Gonzalez, these legal arguments brought little comfort. They had lost a brother, an uncle, and a friend. His absence was permanent, and no courtroom debate about schizophrenia or delusion could soften the blow of his death. As they listened to the proceedings, their pain was sharpened by the knowledge that the system might not deliver the punishment they believed was deserved. After weeks of testimony, the outcome became clear. Tyree Lincoln Smith would not be convicted in the way most killers are. The court found him not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead of a prison sentence, Smith was ordered to be committed to a maximum security psychiatric facility, where he would remain under the authority of the state for decades to come. The ruling divided opinions. To some, it was an acknowledgment of reality. Smith's illness had been the driving force behind his actions, and treatment, not punishment, was the only humane response. To others, it was a miscarriage of justice, a technicality that allowed a killer to escape the consequences of his crime. For the Gonzalez family, it was a bitter outcome, one that left them feeling as though their loved one's death had been met with something less than true justice. As Smith was transferred into the psychiatric system, The city of Bridgeport exhaled in uneasy relief. The man who had carried out one of its darkest crimes was no longer free, but questions lingered. Could treatment ever erase the danger he posed? Could a man who had once listened to voices commanding him to kill ever be trusted again among the public? These questions would not be answered in 2012. They would linger for more than a decade, waiting for the day when Tyree Lincoln Smith's fate would once again come under review. Following the court's ruling, Tyree Lincoln Smith was transferred to Whiting Forensic Hospital in Middletown, Connecticut. It was not a prison, but it was no place of freedom either. Whiting was a maximum-security psychiatric institution, built to contain the most dangerous patients in the state, men and women who had committed crimes but were deemed legally insane. For Smith, it became both his sanctuary and his cage. Life inside Whiting was regimented, governed by rules designed to balance treatment with security. The walls were high, the doors locked at all times, and every movement of patients was monitored. Days were structured around therapy sessions, medication schedules, and supervised activities. For staff members, the challenge was not only to protect the public from those confined within, but also to confront the fragile realities of minds fractured by illness. Smith entered the hospital as one of its most notorious patients. His crime had been widely reported, and the gruesome details of cannibalism lingered in the public imagination. Within Whiting, however, he was just another patient among many. The goal was to stabilize him, to bring his mind into alignment with reality, and to prevent a return to the horrors of the past. Treatment began with medication. Smith was placed on a strict regimen of antipsychotic drugs, designed to quiet the voices and blunt the force of his hallucinations. Over time, the medication took effect. The voices that once commanded him grew faint, then silent. His moods leveled, his behaviors became more predictable, and the violent impulses that had once controlled him seemed to recede. But medication alone was not enough. Therapy was equally critical. In group sessions, Smith was encouraged to talk about his illness, to confront the delusions that had shaped his actions, and to build strategies for living safely. In individual therapy, psychiatrists worked to peel back the layers of his mind, examining the roots of his schizophrenia and monitoring for any signs of relapse. Progress was measured not in weeks or months, but in years. Stability in a patient like Smith could only be trusted after long periods of consistent behavior. Within the hospital walls, he developed a routine. Meals were served at set times. Recreation was limited to closely supervised areas. Contact with the outside world was minimal, often restricted to carefully monitored phone calls or letters. Family visits were rare, and for Smith, the community beyond Whiting became a distant memory. His life was now defined by doctors, orderlies, and the constant hum of security cameras. Yet behind the locked doors, questions lingered. Could a man who had committed such a crime ever truly be rehabilitated? They evaluated his progress, documented his behavior, and considered whether he remained a threat. Years passed, and the stability Smith achieved became undeniable. Reports described him as compliant with treatment, cooperative with staff, and engaged in therapy. The violent outbursts that once defined him faded into memory. To some, he was proof that psychiatric care could succeed even in the most extreme cases. To others, his calm demeanor was unsettling, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. During his confinement, Smith was reviewed periodically by the Psychiatric Security Review Board, the state body responsible for determining whether individuals committed under the insanity verdict remained dangerous. Each review was a careful process. Doctors submitted reports, attorneys made arguments, and board members weighed the risk. 4 years, the outcome was always the same. Smith remained confined, the danger he posed too great to risk release. But as time went on, the reports grew more favorable. Smith's schizophrenia was described as being in full remission, his substance abuse disorders under control. He adhered strictly to his medication, showed insight into his illness, and accepted the structure of his life. Slowly, the notion of release began to move from unthinkable to possible. By the early 2020s, Smith had spent more than a decade inside Whiting. To the outside world, he was a figure frozen in memory, the cannibal killer of Bridgeport. But within the hospital, he had become something different. A long-term patient, stable, predictable, and seemingly changed. Whether that change was enough to warrant freedom would become the defining question of the years ahead. And in time, that question would be answered. The very idea that Tyree Lincoln Smith could one day walk free stirred deep unease across Connecticut. For the Gonzalez family, it was a living nightmare. For more than a decade, Tyree Lincoln Smith remained behind the secure walls of Whiting Forensic Hospital. To many in the outside world, it seemed certain that he would never again walk free. His crime had been too gruesome, too deeply etched into the memory of Connecticut. But inside the hospital, time moved differently. Each year brought new evaluations, fresh reports, and careful scrutiny of his progress. Slowly, a different picture began to emerge. The reviews conducted by the Psychiatric Security Review Board were the foundation of this process. The board existed to answer a difficult question. Had the patient's mental illness been brought under control enough to allow him to live outside strict confinement? The first significant step came in the form of temporary leave programs. These programs allowed patients to transition gradually from full confinement toward community living, under the strictest supervision. In 2023, Smith was granted such a leave. He was transferred to a supervised group home in Waterbury, where he would live under 24-hour monitoring. Every aspect of his life remained controlled. He was required to take his medications, attend therapy sessions, and adhere to a rigid structure. Staff at the group home reported on his behavior constantly, and any sign of instability would have triggered his immediate return to Whiting. For 9 months, Smith lived under this arrangement. To those overseeing his case, this period was proof that his progress inside Whiting could hold up beyond its walls. To the Gonzalez family, however, it was a nightmare unfolding in real time. They were forced to reckon with the reality that the man who had killed and mutilated their loved one was no longer behind the secure doors of the hospital, but was now living in a community setting. As Smith continued on temporary leave, the Psychiatric Security Review Board prepared to make its most consequential decision yet. In early 2025, the board convened to consider whether Smith should be granted conditional release. This decision would not give him total freedom. Far from it. Conditional release meant that he would remain under supervision, his treatment and activities strictly monitored by state authorities. But it would also mean that his time as a confined patient at Whiting was officially over. In February of 2025, the board delivered its decision. Tyree Lincoln Smith would be granted conditional release. He would remain in the community under close supervision, his treatment and activities monitored, his freedom tightly restricted. To the board, it was the culmination of more than a decade of treatment and oversight. To the public, it was a shocking announcement that reopened old wounds. For the Gonzalez family, the decision was devastating. More than 13 years after Angel Gonzalez's death, they were forced once again to know the man responsible will soon be walking free in a community once again. Their grief was reignited, their sense of justice shaken. For lawmakers, the release became a flashpoint, sparking outrage and calls to reconsider how the system handles those found not guilty by reason of insanity. And for Smith himself, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one in which his every step would be watched, his every choice scrutinized, as the state attempted to balance the rights of the mentally ill with the safety of the public. The conditions were extensive. Smith was prohibited from contact with certain individuals, including members of the victim's family. He was barred from possessing weapons of any kind. His movements outside of the group home would be tightly regulated, requiring approval and often the accompaniment of staff. He would continue psychiatric treatment indefinitely, with doctors reporting his progress to the board at regular intervals. Any violation, no matter how small, could trigger his immediate return to a secure hospital. The decision also reached the halls of government. Several Connecticut lawmakers condemned the release, calling it reckless and dangerous. They argued that the state had failed to protect the public, that no amount of medication or monitoring could erase the brutality of Smith's crime. Senator Heather Summers described the ruling as outrageous, while others called it a betrayal of the Gonzalez family. Their voices amplified the growing chorus of those who believed the system had chosen leniency over safety. Editorials appeared in local papers, reflecting the divide. Some urged the public to trust in psychiatric science, to accept that treatment could change even the most broken of minds. Others warned that the decision placed Connecticut in uncharted territory, gambling with public safety in the name of rehabilitation. The release of Tyree Lincoln Smith in 2025 became more than just a legal milestone. It became a symbol of the tension between justice and mercy, between the protection of society and the rehabilitation of the mentally ill. It asked difficult questions that had no easy answers. As Smith settled into his new reality, the debate only intensified. His life was now confined not by prison walls, but by the watchful eyes of a system determined to manage his every move. But not all voices condemned the decision. Mental health advocates pushed back, reminding the public that Smith had not been convicted in the traditional sense, but had been found not guilty by reason of insanity. They argued that treatment and recovery were not only possible but proven in his case. Visits from outsiders were controlled, sometimes outright prohibited. He was banned from contacting Angel Gonzalez's family, and his interactions with the public were heavily restricted. Phone calls, internet use, and letters were often subject to review. Even friendships, if they developed at all, were tightly managed. In many ways, Smith's life remained more isolated than it had been inside Whiting. His release also required regular reporting back to the Psychiatric Security Review Board. Every 3 months, staff and medical professionals submitted evaluations detailing his compliance, stability, and interactions. These reports were scrutinized, debated, and archived. His future depended on them. The story of Tyree Lincoln Smith did not end with his release. Instead, it became a case that lingered in memory, haunting Connecticut like a shadow that refused to fade. Years had passed since the crime, yet the name still carried weight, still provoked unease, still drew sharp breaths from those who remembered what had been done. For some, the case was an open wound. For others, it was a lesson that could not be ignored. In Bridgeport, the abandoned building where Smith murdered Angel Gonzalez was torn down, its walls unable to bear the weight of what had happened inside. But even in demolition, the story clung to the community. Residents spoke of that night in 2012 as if it had happened yesterday. Within Connecticut's legal and psychiatric systems, the Smith case became a point of reference, studied and debated by professionals who saw in it both danger and progress. Some viewed his release as proof that treatment worked, that even the most severe cases of psychosis could be managed with structure and medication. Others saw it as a warning, that oversight could never fully account for risk, that trust placed in fragile systems could one day collapse. His case was filed not only in court records but in the collective caution of policymakers, shaping how future decisions might be made. In the years to follow, his case became less a story about one man and more a symbol of larger questions. It asked how far society was willing to go in the name of mercy. It asked whether the human mind, once shattered by illness, could ever be trusted again after violence. It asked if justice was something owed only to the victims or something extended even to those who had done the unthinkable. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Tyree Lincoln Smith case was the silence it left behind. The silence of Angel Gonzalez, whose voice was extinguished in 2012. In the end, Smith's story was not one of resolution but of contradiction. He was a man both confined and released, treated yet feared, alive yet bound forever to a crime that could never be undone. His release in 2025 did not close the chapter. It extended it, ensuring that the questions surrounding his case would echo long after the decisions had been made. The world moved forward, but the unease remained. A reminder of what had happened, a warning of what could happen again, and a legacy that, for Connecticut, would never truly fade. Thank you for your time. We appreciate your constant love and support. Stay well and stay safe. I will be seeing you on our next episode.